If you didn't know, we've been playing a lot of Baldur's Gate 3 lately. A lot. A lot. I don't sleep anymore. I just play Baldur's Gate 3 and help me.
Yeah.
Help me. Help me.
We're loving Baldur's Gate 3, but as veterans of Dungeons & Dragons, we keep finding more and more ways that Larian has changed the core classes of 5th edition.
With all the hours that we've put into the game and all the deep conversations that Monty and I have had, one of the things that keeps coming up is, did you notice that this class doesn't have this ability or this ability works better? So we've been talking a lot about that and wanted to share that with you today.
My name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin, and we
are
the Dungeon Dudes.
And today we're going to dive into the biggest change for each class in Baldur's Gate 3.
There's a lot to discuss today, so let's get rolling.
This week's episode of our show has been sponsored by Dragon Shield's new Dice Companions for both players and game masters.
If you're anything like us, then you own a lot of dice. And if there's one thing that Monty and I love, it's something to carry our dice around in. And that's where these amazing dice trays come into play.
Dragon Shield sent us a few of these latest Dice Companions, and these might be some of our favorite dice storage boxes and combo rolling trays we've ever rolled our dice with. They come in a couple different sizes. There's the nice small Dice Companion, but then there's the big Player Companion, which I love because not only does it have a massive rolling surface, a dry erase spot for your character sheet, plenty of room for your miniatures with some padded storage. I got 4 sets of dice in the side here, as well as plenty of room for pencils and pens. Basically, you could fit everything and your notebook right in here, and you're ready to go to game night, pack it up all in one. I love it.
With the smaller dice tray, what's really awesome is that it actually has the ability to detach the one side and magnetically attach it on one of 3 intervals, basically allowing you to change the compartmentalization of your dice tray. So depending on what you want to fit in there, there's a lot of different options. If you're hoping to get your hands on your own dice tray or maybe give one as a gift to your dungeon master or player, you can check the links below to grab one today. We also have a promo code and a giveaway that you can find in the details in the description of this video.
So big thank you to Dragon Shield for sponsoring this week's episode and sending us our new favorite dice trays.
Thank you so much, and let's get on to the episode.
So rolling along into the class changes, the Barbarian at first has a subtle but massive change in how you can build your character, because in Baldur's Gate 3, Rage and Reckless Attack don't require you to be making your attack using strength, opening the door for barbarians that are primarily built on dexterity, but also two-handed weapons. It's also interesting to note that Great Weapon Master works with a much wider range of weapons in the game as well, meaning that there's opportunities for dexterity-based barbarians to come out swinging in a big way.
A few smaller changes with the Barbarian is that the Totem Barbarian is now referred to as the Wild Heart, and you actually get to change your totem every time that you level up, if you want to. The Berserker's Frenzy ability is much more useful in Baldur's Gate 3. It no longer gives you exhaustion. It does give you a penalty when you're done frenzying, but that goes away at the end of combat, so it's much more useful and I think much better.
Frenzy gives you a bonus action attack that you can use to either make a melee attack or do a frenzied throw. And while the penalty does stack up, I find that combats are over before the penalty gets too bad anyways. And I love this change to the Berserker Barbarian. It makes them far more playable than the classic 5th edition exhaustion after you finish the frenzy.
I think also there's a lot of itemization available for the Barbarian, which is something we don't see a lot of, unless you're doing Great Weapon Master and picking up a magical two-handed weapon. But the itemization allows both Monty and I have built very different Barbarians in Baldur's Gate 3. Monty found a lot of items that help thrown weapons that he's been able to build a throwing Barbarian around. And meanwhile, I gave my Barbarian boots of speed and a ring that allows them to Misty Step. And so they are just teleporting and moving all around the battlefield. They have more maneuverability than anybody else in my game and are just killing everything.
The itemization is actually a big game changer for the Barbarian, and while it's not a big change to the class itself, I feel like it changes the way they play in so many ways, because there's so many cool things to throw at people, whether or not you're just picking up a goblin and throwing it at another goblin, which there is an achievement for that, so make sure you get it.
As we move on to the Bard, there's actually quite a few notable changes with the Bard. First and foremost, and I think the biggest one, is that their Bardic Inspiration is no longer tied to their Charisma. Instead, it's tied to Proficiency bonus +1.
This means that a 6th level Bard ends up with 4 uses of Bardic Inspiration. This actually opens up the possibility for a Swords Bard that doesn't have a high Charisma score and focuses on their dexterity for weapon attacks and still gets a lot of uses of Bardic Inspiration.
Another notable change is the massive improvement to Song of Rest. Song of Rest is now essentially in Baldur's Gate 3 just an extra short rest.
It's huge.
Yeah.
It is huge. It actually makes, for me, I feel like having a Bard in your party is almost essential because of this, because it means that you're able to go far more encounters without long resting. I guess on the counterpoint to this is that maybe you know, camp supplies are so plentiful that you can kind of safely long rest after every encounter anyways. But I like this a lot, and I've quite enjoyed being able to have that extra short rest button with the amount that I've been using Warlocks and Fighters especially.
With Bards, they also restricted magical secrets. So you still get magical secrets, but it's a very specific list of spells that you get to choose from, which feels incredibly different. And I actually think a sad downgrade from what you have available in D&D 5e.
Yeah, it means that like you can't pick up things like shield or even aid. And I noticed it in particular because a bunch of spells were added to the Bard spell list in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, and Larian didn't implement those changes for Baldur's Gate 3 either. So it feels like Bards do have a much more restricted spell list. This is also doubled by the fact that a lot of enchantment and illusion spells were not implemented in Baldur's Gate 3 at all. Most notably, Suggestion is not in Baldur's Gate 3. Phantasmal Force, nerfed to the ground. Hypnotic Pattern, significantly nerfed but still strong. Major Image, not in the game at all. And so with all of these changes, the Bard spell list does feel quite different from tabletop.
A small change, but one that I definitely have felt the impact of since I'm playing a Bard, is that my Jack of all trades doesn't apply to my initiative rolls, which is something that I very much like in D&D.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'm often going middle ground, I think, in most combat encounters.
Absolutely. The other kind of subtle change, and this is a change that impacts all spellcasters, including bards, clerics, druids, wizards, sorcerers, warlocks, is that characters in Baldur's Gate 3 can have a melee set equipped, a ranged set equipped, and bards and characters proficient with musical instruments can also have a musical instrument equipped at the same time. This is doubled by the fact that spell components aren't really a thing in Baldur's Gate 3, so normally some spellcasters have to worry about, oh, I need to put my rapier away to pull out my lute so I can cast a spell, or I need to switch between my ranged weapon and my melee weapon. This weapon swapping, as long as you're staying within your equipped set, isn't really a thing in Baldur's Gate 3. So it means that you can very easily switch from spellcasting to shooting to stabbing without having to spend actions or bonus actions doing it.
As we move on to the Cleric, I think the Cleric's spell list actually survived the best out of any spellcaster in the game. It's pretty much all here, everything that you would want. The biggest noticeable difference, I think, in the Cleric is actually the way Divine Intervention works. Divine Intervention is now only a once per game ability. You get to use it one time.
Yeah.
My big problem with this is that with an ability that you're only going to use once in the entire game, I probably won't use it because I won't know when the right time to use it is.
So you can actually use it to conjure a pretty powerful melee weapon that you can give to another character in their party, but I have to confess, I finished the game and forgot to use it. Beyond this, a couple of the cleric domains have had very selective changes to them based on the fact that some of their domain spells are not in Baldur's Gate 3. For example, the light domain, scrying isn't a spell in Baldur's Gate 3, so the light domain got Destructive Wave, which is a surprising upgrade in many cases. In some cases, the changes to certain spells do make domains a little bit weaker. Dimension Door and Polymorph are not really as powerful as they feel like they should be in tabletop, so that this really lowers the stock of the Trickery domain, in my opinion.
Another minor change is that Destroy Undead now deals radiant damage instead of just outright killing the undead monsters.
Yeah.
As we're moving on to Druids, Druids have some subtle but pretty impactful changes that are made in their class abilities, mostly in how they're implemented in the game. One small but I think important change is that Druids are free to wear metal armor and carry metal shields. There's no restriction on that in Baldur's Gate 3.
Similarly, Wild Shape is restricted to some very specific forms that have been pre-programmed into the game. So you don't have your smorgasbord choice of any possible beast. There's a couple key options in there that you get to choose from, which incidentally do include owlbears. But Wild Shape, I think, is a little bit more brought down to earth in terms of the number of options that it presents to you. I also do think that this kind of goes hand in hand with the fact that flying is implemented kind of weirdly in Baldur's Gate 3. You can't fly high over the battlefield and evade combat in that way, or fly over to evade huge swaths of the map, although it's still pretty useful in that way. And Larian have implemented tons of little holes that only small animals can enter through into, which is kind of delightful in actual play.
Also, for all of those who like to multi-class with the Druid, you can't use special actions like Rage, for example, while you're wild-shaped.
The fighter is very faithful to its 5th edition roots, and I think that they come out swinging in Baldur's Gate 3 as a very, very powerful class, especially given how overall combat-oriented Baldur's Gate 3 is as a game. But there are still some small changes here and there with a lot of the maneuvers and the spells that Eldritch Knights get. For instance, Eldritch Knights actually aren't super restricted in the abjuration and evocation spells that they pick up along the way. And some of the Battlemaster maneuvers have been implemented specifically one way or the other. For example, you have to decide to use precision attack before you actually make the attack. It's not a reaction that you can kind of apply to a dice roll afterwards.
They removed Student of War and Know Your Enemy from the Battlemaster, which doesn't really seem like that big of an impact, honestly. As well, they gave Eldritch Knights ritual spellcasting, so that's pretty neat. You don't have to blow spell slots if you have a ritual spell.
Ultimately, I think the Fighter and the Cleric feel like two of the least overall changed classes. I feel like any Cleric build or Fighter build that works in 5th edition basically works as presented in Baldur's Gate 3 just as well. I would say there's lots of great magic items for fighters to use in BG3, and I think that they're kind of the beneficiaries of the diverse array of items and the fact that there's no attunement in BG3 as well. So you can have awesome magic weapons, awesome magic armor, and have all this really overpowered gear.
When we come to monks, though, monks have seen quite a few changes in Baldur's Gate 3, and I'd say pretty much all for the better.
Monks are much more powerful in Baldur's Gate 3, in my opinion, not the least of which is because of the changes to the Tavern Brawler feat, but we'll get to that in a moment. Monks can wear armor and use their martial arts, which really opens up the scope for how you can multi-class with a monk build in BG3.
Not only can they wear armor, but they can also use shields as well. So you could be a shield knight monk and still use your martial arts. Another small change, but I think it's amazing, is the fact that Flurry of Blows can be used as a bonus action, even if you didn't take the attack action on your turn. So if you're multi-classing or have something else to do with your turn, you can do all sorts of cool abilities and still throw in a few punches or kicks.
Stunning Strike is an action. So you unfortunately can't combine Stunning Strike with Flurry of Blows. You have to click it on the bar and then apply it to the attack. So it does mean that it's only applicable to the attack action attacks rather than your Flurry of Blows attacks with the way that the interface is sort of programmed. But ultimately, I think the changes to the Monk kind of made me look at the Barbarian. And I think the Monk Barbarian or the Bonk, is really cool because you could build a dexterity-based character or a strength-based character with either of these, take Tavern Brawler, and destroy the world with unarmed attacks and thrown weapons. I think it's really strong, and I'm really excited by it. It feels like a build that... And you can still be wearing medium armor while you're doing this.
I think my second playthrough is going to be a dwarf-throwing monk barbarian.
Oh my God.
I think it's... I just gotta.
It doubles up with the fact that there's a bunch of magic items, particularly magic gloves, that add to unarmed weapon damage. So you can end up with a character that is adding twice their strength modifier to unarmed attacks, adding their wisdom modifier to unarmed attacks, getting an extra D10 necrotic damage or radiant damage on their unarmed attacks. It's really quite mind-blowing, like how much unarmed attack damage has been buffed up in Baldur's Gate 3 when you factor in the itemization. And then when you add in the thrown weapon attacks, the way that you can interact with the environment, oh man, I think we're going to see a lot of strong, amazing damage dealing monk builds coming out.
There are a few other lesser changes to the monk. For example, monks, one of my favorite abilities of the monks in D&D is that you gain the ability to run across water or up walls. It doesn't really work in Baldur's Gate 3, so instead they gave them an extra 20 feet on their jump, which I think still gets us where we want to go with that ability. They've added in some specific changes to the way shadow monks work with some of their abilities. They've actually moved one of their abilities far lower and then added a new ability at 11th level. And the Way of the Four Elements monk can regain half their key points once per day. So depending on which subclass you're picking, there's a few minor changes to help boost things up even more.
In contrast, the Paladin, I think, also makes it into Baldur's Gate 3 with pretty minimal changes. Most notably, Paladins in Baldur's Gate 3 do have to choose their oath at level 1. And it's very interesting finding all the ways that it is possible to break your oath in the game and become an oath breaker paladin. So you will actually find several instances in the game where, depending on which oath you selected for your paladin, you're going to get some really cool dialogue options, but you're also going to have to face down the reality that you could break your oath. Although what I have been seeing is people making lists of all the ways that you can break your oath because they want to become an oath breaker. Because it's a good subclass.
Channel Divinity is now called Channel Oath, and every subclass gets a unique Channel Oath ability at level 1 when they choose their subclass. So that's a cool new feature, and I think it makes sense and adds some cool stuff for the Paladin.
It does, and this is also broadly changed by the fact that now Divine Sense just gives the Paladin advantage on attack rolls against undead, fiends, and other extraplanar creatures. So every Paladin against undead and fiends can kind of play with the Oath of Vengeance's Vow of Enmity power, and the Oath of Vengeance gets basically an extra use of that thanks to the way Divine Sense has changed. So I think this is a big change because, first of all, there's a lot of undead and fiends in Baldur's Gate 3. So you get a lot of mileage out of this ability, and Paladins love having advantage on attacks when they're attacking with Great Weapon Master and loading up a massive Divine Smite. One of the things to note with the way the Paladin works in Baldur's Gate 3 is you do have to decide to use your Divine Smite before you make the attack, but it's only expended if that attack hits. You might not know this, but there's a menu in the game that lets you decide when to use reactions and when you want reactions triggered. And by default, Paladins will smite when they crit, even if you didn't decide to smite.
That's awesome.
Yeah, but you might want to turn that off depending on your playstyle.
The Ranger also sees a long list of changes, and we're not going to go over all of them right now. The big changes, though, are that Favorite Enemy and Natural Explorer are completely different and give you a list of options to either gain or choose from when you are leveling up as a Ranger. So that I think already changes the core of the class of the Ranger.
Exactly. You can have a Ranger that has heavy armor proficiency from level 1. You can have a Ranger that knows a couple extra cantrips or Find Familiar, or has resistance to cold or fire damage, or even just picks up a couple extra skill proficiencies along the way. I'm really impressed with this change, and I think that it does kind of make the Ranger a very front-loaded class still. Gloomstalker is still amazing. And there's been a lot of changes to how Beastmasters work with their Beast Companions because they have full-on extra turns too. But the Ranger, much like the Monk, comes into Baldur's Gate 3 absolutely swinging.
With the Rogue, I found that the Rogue plays very much how you want a Rogue to play and doesn't feel that different. But I will say that the Thief Rogue, really, their ability that just gives them now a full-on extra bonus action. Right now, I've been using 3 levels of Thief Rogue to tack on to my Gloomstalker Ranger build, and with double hand crossbow Asterion, and it's it's pretty wild.
I think this is a change worth mentioning because characters can dual wield hand crossbows in Baldur's Gate 3 without needing to take any other feats. And this is effectively like giving every character, or rangers and rogues specifically, crossbow expert for free, which means that a thief rogue dual wielding hand crossbows at level 3 can make 3 hand crossbow attacks. And right now, the offhand attack of the hand crossbow is, I think, bugged, and it adds your full ability modifier to damage and twice your ability modifier to damage if you take the 2-weapon fighting style.
Well, that explains why my offhand attacks are doing better than my
Yep.
sneak attacks.
Absolutely. It's a lot of extra damage, and I will say I find it harder to actually land sneak attacks in Baldur's Gate 3 because you need to have advantage to sneak attack, whereas the flanking rule with sneak attack, I haven't been able to get that to work.
I do have a really hard time getting sneak attack to work. It also doesn't help that my main frontliner uses pole arms, and apparently that doesn't count as being based with them. I rarely get the option to use my sneak attack.
Yeah, and you do have to click the sneak attack button to use it. It is noticeable that if you forget, the game does apply sneak attack for you if you had advantage and could have used it, which is kind of good. But ultimately, I found that the big sneak attack damage is kind of hard to notice in Baldur's Gate 3. I feel much more of the impact of dual wielding the hand crossbows.
Yeah. Besides that, though, rogues do get, I think the assassin is a little smoothed out with the way that it plays in combat.
Yeah.
Those are really the only big changes, I think, for the rogue. There's probably more, but those are the ones that stood out to me.
On to the sorcerer. A couple big changes that you'll notice right away is that when you first get Meta Magic at level 2, you can't choose Quicken Spell. You have to wait till level 3 to choose it, but then you get an extra Meta Magic option. So a 3rd level sorcerer knows 3 Meta Magics, one of which can be Quicken Spell. And there's a lot of big changes with Quicken Spell because it's 3 sorcery points now, but
the bonus action spellcasting rule is gone, meaning that Quicken Spell is much more powerful because you can quicken a fireball and then cast a fireball with your action. Obviously, this applies to many other spells beyond fireball, but it's a great example to use.
I actually do think that the bonus action spellcasting rule has a big impact on clerics too, because I'm able to use spells like Healing Word and Mass Healing Word or summon my spiritual weapon in addition to conjuring up the spirit guardians or casting a bigger spell. So I notice it on the cleric, but on the sorcerer, it's just so powerful because you can do really absurd things on the sorcerer, like twin haste on yourself and a party member, and then cast a fireball, and then quicken another fireball, and then on subsequent rounds, you can fireball. You can just all the time, or you can do amazing combinations like have 1 level of cleric, so you can cast create water, and then have chain lightning or lightning bolt because the wet condition makes them vulnerable to lightning damage. The fact that you're allowed to quicken any spell and still cast another leveled spell beside it in Baldur's Gate 3 has a lot of implications, and I'm still discovering all the fun tricks that you can do with it. I would probably never implement this change in my actual tabletop games.
As we come to the Warlock, one of the biggest things missing from the Warlock is the Hexblade. But we do get Pact of the Blade, which basically gives you what you wanted from Hexblade anyway. As soon as you choose Pact of the Blade, it allows you to use your charisma and summon a weapon into your hand and use that as your Pact weapon. So Pact of the Blade actually opens the door for us to not be stuck in Hexblade mode and try out some of the other subclasses while wielding a sword.
Yeah, and the Deepen Pact feature upgrades all of the pacts at 5th level. So instead of needing to take the invocation to give you an extra attack with Pact of the Blade, you just get that for free at 5th level when you have the Pact of the Blade. It's worth noting that right now, this feature is actually bugged. And so if you have 5 levels of Warlock, and then you take 5 levels in another class that grants you extra attack, you'll actually be able to make 3 attacks with your Pact weapon. So the Paladin Warlocks really love this combination, but I expect that this is an unintended bug and is going to get fixed. The only downside to it is that you have to rebind your pact weapon every day.
I forget to do that often.
All the time. So many times I've been in combat with Will, and I've been like, all right, he's coming in with the big smite, because I have Will as a Paladin Warlock. And I realized I forgot to bind the pact weapon.
As we move on to the final class, the Wizard, this is kind of the unfortunate story, is I think the Wizard actually loses in terms of all of the classes.
Yeah.
The main thing with the Wizard is that when you think of Wizards in D&D 5e, there's not really a lot of class features that are happening there. The main class feature of the Wizard is their spell list. And spell lists have all been pretty impacted, but I think none more than the Wizard.
Okay, Prestidigitation is not in Baldur's Gate 3. Dispel Magic is not in Baldur's Gate 3. Find Familiar is much weaker overall, I think, in Baldur's Gate 3 than it is in Tabletop. We mentioned Suggestion's not in the game, but also Wall of Force is not in the game. Contingency is not in the game. You don't get access to those 7th, 8th, 9th level wizard spells that really become those game changers. Without these very powerful, unique wizard spells, and with the kind of the tightening of the implementation of many of the spells overall, I think wizards are much less powerful in Baldur's Gate 3 than they are in Tabletop, and I actually don't see a lot of a reason to have one.
Yeah, unfortunately, Gail's the only party member who rarely is in my party when I
Yeah.
go on adventures. Not to mention, ritual casting for wizards has changed. You can still ritual cast, but you have to prepare the ritual spell in order to cast it. The great thing about a wizard is that you can know a ritual spell and just cast it whenever you want as a ritual, but you don't have to prepare it. Now those spells need to take up vital spots in your arsenal when you're setting out on an adventure. Now, you can pause the game at any moment and refinagle your spells, which is kind of nice.
That is a big change, and that is a change that impacts all the spellcasters, including the clerics and the druids and the wizards, as well as any other prepared spellcasters like paladins. You can basically change out whatever spells you have prepared as long as you're not in combat. And so that does mean that you can always have the right arsenal going into whatever combat you're going into. But I still feel like that is a bit of a compromise between what I overall feel the wizard spell list. I wouldn't say it's gutted, but it's definitely not as diverse and powerful as it is in Tabletop.
Well, the thing about wizards in tabletop is that once you get to high levels, they're the most powerful class in the game. At low levels, they're kind of weak.
Yeah.
But in Baldur's Gate 3, you never hit that moment where you're like, I'm the most powerful character now. You kind of start weak and you end middle.
Yeah, and really, I think in a big way, wizards kind of hit their prime around level 9 or 10. And level 9, 10, 11, and 12, that's Act 3 of Baldur's Gate 3. You're already at least 2/3 of the way through the game. So you have to spend a lot of time. Like, it took me 30 hours of gameplay to get through Act 1. And that was like doing everything, but that's still a lot of gameplay time at the lower levels of play when wizards aren't that strong. There's one change for the wizard as well, which is a big one. You can learn any spell from a scroll and cast that spell that you learned from a scroll if you prepared it, if you have the spell slots for it. What this means is that if you have one level of wizard and you took 11 levels of cleric, that one wizard level is going to let you read the spell scroll of Chain Lightning and prepare Chain Lightning.
I think that this is actually the best thing that they've done for wizards is allowed you to multi-class with one level of wizard. In Baldur's Gate 3, I can see actual borderline absurd combos where you're like, I will take one level of wizard, a few levels of cleric, a few levels of paladin, maybe I'll throw 2 levels of fighter in there. You could have this weird mismatch that can just like learn any spell in the game, make a bunch of attacks, let's hand crossbow, I don't know. There's shenanigans in this game.
Yeah.
And the one level of wizard dip is actually really intriguing because it just says, hey, you took one level of wizard, now you can learn any spell that you find on a scroll. And there's a lot
there
of
are
scrolls.
Now, this is counterbalanced by the fact that if you don't have a good intelligence score, you're only going to be able to prepare one wizard spell. But that's further counterbalanced by the fact that in Act 1, you can find a headband of intellect, which sets your intelligence to 17.
It's pretty easy to find.
It's pretty easy to find. So you can always have a character that has 1 level of wizard and can prepare 4 wizard spells of any level and have a decent spell save and attack modifier with that spell. So you can build, I think the obvious one here is grabbing Lightning Bolt and Chain Lightning as a Tempest Domain Cleric and just having fun with lightning.
To wrap this all up, one of the other great aspects of Baldur's Gate 3 is the fact that there's so many magic items that let you break these builds.
Yeah.
If I have my my gloves of dexterity and my headband of intellect, and like I could name some other items, but you can just start piling them up to like break your character to multi-class into a bunch of things and excel at all of them. And I think that that's kind of wild, but some of the item pairing that you can do is really a beautiful element of the game.
Totally. And I do think that from a tabletop perspective, like when we're zooming out, I think that this is probably why attunement is a thing in tabletop, because you can really gear out your characters in Baldur's Gate 3 in almost a dozen very rare or legendary items.
I'm having a lot of fun with the game, and I think one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that when you're playing D&D, the DM is a player as well, and so there's a lot more balance to make sure that the DM is having fun with the players as well. In Baldur's Gate 3, they kind of just threw the reins off because you're playing on your couch, maybe with your friends, but there's no dungeon master that you need to worry about. If you and your friends decide to build the wackiest combos ever that combine things in such interesting ways that you're just blowing things up, as long as you're having fun playing Baldur's Gate 3, then you're good.
Totally. And it's super wild. Like, if you just want to play that party of 4 halfling barbarians and put explosive barrels beside every single boss, because this is a Larian game, you can. And so I feel like Larian really leaned into the shenaniganery with Baldur's Gate 3, and that makes the game a lot of fun. And maybe the takeaway of it is asking ourselves, like, what is the balance of all these things? Because as much as I love the class changes that they've made, it's very hard to make the argument that they're balanced.
and in Baldur's Gate 3, the fun lands on the player. It's all about the player's fun. Some of these I might love to see in tabletop. I would love to see the reworking of that the monk gets, and maybe the changes that the ranger gets. I think those are the 2 biggest ones that I'm like, hey, wizards, maybe take a look at those and see what we can learn from those.
And I do think that many of the magic items that Larian introduced in Baldur's Gate 3 are great, but they should have attunement. Yeah, because there's a certain point where you've stacked up too many of them, and it's too much. I think that the basic weapon swapping, just the fact that you can have a melee set and a range set, and you don't have to worry about spell components, that's a huge change. The fact that prepared spellcasters can change their prepared spells at any time, that's a huge change. And honestly, these feel like good quality of life changes that I could see just having in tabletop.
So this is not an exhaustive list. There are a lot of other changes with the classes in Baldur's Gate 3. These are just the ones that stood out the most to us. Tell us if there's other changes that you've noticed that have had a big impact on your games, or which of these changes you plan to start using in your tabletop games in the comments below.
The videos that we create on our channel are made possible with the incredible generosity of our Patreon supporters. And our Patreon Discord is super hopping right now with people talking about their playthroughs of Baldur's Gate 3. So if you're looking for a great community to join, to chat about the game and connect with other passionate fans of tabletop games, check out our Patreon and get on our Discord server.
And if you want to help support us in other ways, check out the Super Thanks button down below. If you want to see us playing D&D, not Baldur's Gate 3, although you might see some of that too eventually, check out our actual play in the Worlds of Drakkenheim, which is Tuesday evenings on Twitch. You can find all the previous episodes right up over here.
And we've got plenty more videos about 5th edition and Baldur's Gate right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and ring that bell so that you never miss an episode.
Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time
in the dungeon.